A lot of times promoters didn't really give a shit, and they just said, "I'm not grooming it. It's fine. Let's run the race. This is how much money I'm going to make. Let's get these fans out of here." I would get rid of 450s and Supercross. I think it's just too much motor. Back when we watch us, sometimes I watch footage of myself and David Bailey and O'Mara and the Ward and Glover and all that. I think, wow, man, we were really slow.
In this episode of Rick Johnson, The Big Interview, the 7-time champion talks about how it all began, how he changed motocross, and why he thinks tracks are just too smooth.
Motocross in the 80s. Everybody says it was a magic time. It must have been pretty magic for you.
Well, motocross in the 80s was peaking in a lot of different ways. The tracks were becoming more and more spectacular. The suspension and the wheels, everything was getting much, much stronger. And also the athleticism of the riders as well went up. Back in the 60s and the early 70s, a lot of riders would pace themselves, or it was outdoors, or it was scrambles back then. But when Supercross came on board, it changed the sport dramatically when it came to visibility and physicality, and also how strong the motorcycles were.
So you started riding in the late 70s, basically, in El Cajon, where you were.
Yep.
That's where you're from. So I'm guessing Marty Smith and people like that were your heroes back in the day. Who was the biggest hero you had back then?
Well, I started riding motorcycles back in El Cajon in actually the late 60s, early 70s. I was 3 years old, and then I'd ride up and down the streets. Well, there was a guy named Murray Hoffman, was the first, really, I'm going to say, the king of El Cajon. He did dirt track, he did motocross, he did road racing, did everything, and he was the king of wheelies. He also lived in our neighborhood. But then once I got on XR75s, racing at Speedway 117 and Carlsbad Raceway, and the different places, Marty Smith, Marty Tripes, Mike Tripes, Brock Glover, Tommy Croft, Marty Motes, the list went on and on. And those were just the older guys. Then I was racing against Ron Lachine, Scott Burnworth, Clint Hardick, a lot of these different guys growing up. So I had competition everywhere I went. It didn't matter if I was going on a Wednesday night race. I had a stacked gate of at least 5 or 6 guys that could beat me. I would go practice on a Wednesday after school. Brock Glover would show up, Ron Turner would show up, Mike Tripes might be there, and we had tracks in Santee, Lakeside, El Cajon, Kearney Mesa, Miramar. There was all these different tracks, and everybody kind of found out where everyone was going, and sometimes the competition was more severe than a national or a GP.
So what did you start riding? What were your first bikes back in the late 60s, early 70s?
Well, my first bike was called a Rupp, a Petro 1.5 horse. It had little wings on the outside. My dad, we were walking through a Sears. I don't know what he was down there for, and I saw that thing. I climbed up on it. Of course, it had a do not sit sign on it, but I sat on it, and he just thought, and that's where my dad was. It didn't have to be my birthday or Christmas or whatever. The time was right. He bought it, took it home, and I would ride that up and down the street when I was 3 years old. Then as I grew a little bit older, I started doing some TT racing. Kind of, they had some of that over in Europe, but it was more of an American thing. And did some sliding around when I was 7 or 8 years old. Then we quit doing that for a couple of years, then started racing motocross when I was 9, and then I was hooked. But during that whole time, I rode almost every day because we moved up in the house up on the hill. We had 1.5 acres, which isn't that much land, but it was enough for me to make a track around my house. So every day I could ride there, or I could go down the street, or there was like 5 or 6 tracks around the neighborhood that I could go to. So I was riding all the time.
And why do you think it was such a hotbed of motocross, El Cajon and San Diego at that time?
San Diego was a hotbed for riding because you had El Cajon, San Diego, Kearney Mesa, Carlsbad, Chula Vista, and then we had the weather. We could ride all year round. Plus, we had multiple tracks: Verona Oaks, Four Corners, Carlsbad Raceway, Speedway 117, not too far was Saddleback, Escape Country. The list goes on and on, as well as a lot of us grew up riding out in the desert, out in Glamis or Ocotillo Wells and things like that. So everything around it was off-road. If your dad had a Jeep, he went off-roading. If you had a dune buggy, you went to Glamis. But something had to happen for the kids, and that's when motorcycles came into play. So having all those guys just doing it for fun, and then now all of a sudden you create a race, there's a whole bunch of natural talent, and everybody was into it.
So is it different today? Has has the situation changed?
The situation's changed. San Diego's not the hotbed anymore. For one, real estate's too expensive. All those places where we had tracks, I had from my house, I had Gage's track, my track, Brock's track, Hippie Hollow, the Dairy, Crest. And those were all within a gas tanks. I could fill up my bike, ride there, do a half-hour moto, and ride home on an XR75. So you had multiple surfaces and you weren't running one track. Today, everything is so sterile. Same thing with the races. Back when we were racing, you'd see different people on the track, photographers doing this, photographers doing that. Now everything is just so sterile, and it has to be for safety regulations for a lot of reasons. But now you go to Star West, you go to Paris, you go to Glen Helen, you go to these different tracks where it's groomed and everybody kind of has that mentality, where before it was much more freestyle, and San Diego was a perfect environment. Now you see in Florida is the hot spot, and that's because everybody owns the property and builds their own tracks.
So it's mainly a real estate problem. I guess Corona has become kind of the second home of motocross around here locally for sort of the same reasons.
Well, I think that what they call the Inland Empire, you got Temecula, Marietta, Corona, and all of that, is because the factories all have their test tracks there. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki, KTM, everybody has their tracks, and it's actually Jeff Ward's father-in-law who owns all the property. So it started out, Kawasaki had one right next to the freeway, it's still there. And then he started leasing all the different factories because he could provide water, timers, and also secure it so that people weren't just coming and poaching the tracks. And so with the factories here, the teams here, once again, all the Supercross is starting early January, so it's a perfect place for testing.
If you could change anything about motocross today to make it more like it was back then, what would you change?
I would get rid of 450s in Supercross. I think it's just too much motor. When Roger DeCoster first did Supercross, he was on a TM 400, and the different guys were on 400s. It's a bull in a china cabinet. It's just too much. And so you notice that they turn and pull the trigger. They turn and pull the trigger. And you don't see a lot of the racing in the turns because they just, with that more rotating mass, as much horsepower as it is, there's no delay in the power. It's fuel injected. And you can adjust the electronics to hit the power the way you want. It's just a little too sterile. Back when we watch us, sometimes I watch footage of myself and David Bailey and O'Mara and the Ward and Glover and all that. I think, wow, man, we were really slow. But then I start thinking back, the tire technology wasn't as good. We were on two strokes that had a power. So did you want torque and no top end, or top end and no torque? So depending on the track, that's how you dial that in. So I would like to see Supercross go to 250 four strokes. Keep the 450s for outdoors because I think they look phenomenal out there. And then I would do some track changing. I think the way they design the tracks in Supercross, everything peaks in the middle. I would change it, make the entries more narrow, and build the berm up so the guys would have more passing on the exit. So if you block the inside, that's going to kill your exit speed. And so I would just do some different things. And I've asked and volunteered, but what the hell do I know?
Well, you should know quite a bit. I've won quite a few championships doing that stuff. So if they change the tracks, if they just change the tracks without changing anything else, would that make a significant difference to the way the racing turns out these days?
Yes, I think that, and it all comes to the corners. That's where the passing is. But if you make it to where it's flat on the inside and then it peaks in the middle, that's the one spot. Everybody gravitates to that. And if you come out wide, you open up the inside. If you go up the inside, there's really nowhere to go on the outside. So I think if you start trying some dramatic things, right now we say we have to have, let's say hypothetically, a 30 or 40 foot entry and a 40 foot exit. Well, why not have a 20 foot entry to where you have to kind of get in line, and then it gives you more options on the exit. I think that we've gotten stagnant with track designs and what we're doing now. My hat is off to the track designers, because how many different ways can you scoop dirt? It's got to be very difficult. But I think that we're not trying something new, and don't be afraid to fail. As long as we're not hurting people, don't be afraid to try. And that's what I see. It's like, oh God, we can't do that. We can't change that. The other thing is I would also like to see a yellow flag in the middle of the race so that it doesn't put so much emphasis on the start, and it gives that guy who gets a bad start a chance to fight his way back. Because if a great guy gets a bad start, the good guy will win if he gets a whole shot. And the whole idea is I want to see a fight, and that's what we did in short course off-road truck racing, is they threw a mandatory yellow. Stacked us up. There was no passing on the restart, but just like this, they do the stagger start, get around that turn, and then go. So if you work yourself from last to fifth, I still might have a shot because that guy has only got a 2-second advantage on me, not a 30-second advantage.
I was at the National at Power and listened to some of the track guys who were on the radio talking, and riders were going, hey, that corner over there is too rough and those berms are bad and we need to take those ruts out. And they were kind of grooming this thing into a billiard table kind of situation that just seemed crazy to me, thinking back to when you were racing and there was none of that crazy grooming. Is grooming tracks that much just killing the sport?
When it comes to grooming tracks, I feel two things. One is, in America, they're making them all too deep. They're too much of the same thing. They till them up, they add sand to them, they do all the different stuff, and it just makes this big rutted track where you're just pinned. I like the European tracks where I'll see a little bit, if it's in Malaysia or some of the different tracks where it has the different surfaces where you got to use different throttle and things. That's one. Two is, I think there should be grooming on like the first 2 or 3 turns of the race, just because that's the one time when you have 4 and 5 guys fighting for one. And I don't like to see it where if we're coming down, we can't race to the corner. I have to physically take you out of that. I'm given no choice. If I either stop and get behind you or I plow you out of the way. I don't like that. But I don't like to see the billiard. I don't want to see it like a golf sand trap where we're grooming it absolutely perfect. So it's a fine balance. Once again, is if it needs it, do it. And the same thing, if it's muddy and there's a bottleneck, go around it, change it up. If the jump's too big, knock it down. Don't be afraid to adjust to the day, not to, well, this is our standard. We never groom, or we always groom. You know what? It might not need it. It might need it. Whatever the case may be. Once again, don't be afraid to make a mistake.
Because back in the day, back in the early 80s, they weren't grooming racetracks at all, really.
Correct.
Did you enjoy riding on rough racetracks like that?
Yes. When it came to riding on rough racetracks back in the 80s, sometimes like a lot of times we romanticize what it was. A lot of times it was just lazy. A lot of times promoters didn't really give a shit, and they just said, I'm not grooming it, it's fine, let's run the race, this is how much money I'm going to make, let's get these fans out of here. The technology for watering the tracks, and now some places have fire hoses and they can do the different stuff, and I credit a lot to Mammoth Mountain. They water the track with fire hoses throughout the day. But now they're getting so much better at watering the track and, once again, grooming it, and then keeping the dirt, the sand and clay content to where it stays pretty consistent throughout the day. You don't see much dust anymore.